Henry Jackson woke up early just as he always did. The sun was still low in the sky, painting the world in soft shades of orange and pink. He shuffled to the kitchen in his slippers, made a pot of coffee, and carried a steaming mug outside to his porch. It was his favorite time of day. Sitting on the old wooden chair that creaked whenever he moved, Henry enjoyed the quiet. The air smelled like autumn, crisp leaves and cool breezes. Maplewood was a small town where everyone seemed to know each other. Henry had lived there for over 40 years. People often stopped by his house to say hello or ask for advice. They knew him as a kind man who never turned anyone away. If someone needed help fixing a fence or carrying groceries, Henry was always ready to lend a hand. Life wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. That morning, though, peace didn't last long. A police car rolled down the street slowly, its tires crunching against the gravel road. It came to a stop right in front of Henry's house. 2 officers stepped out. One was tall with short blonde hair, wearing sunglasses even though the sun wasn't bright yet. His nameplate read Phillips. The other officer was shorter, with curly brown hair tucked under her cap. Her badge said Dawson. Henry watched them approach, feeling curious. He hadn't seen any trouble around the neighborhood lately. As they walked closer, he gave them a polite nod. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm and warm. "Officer." Phillips didn't return the greeting. Instead, he crossed his arms and frowned. "Are you Henry Jackson?" he asked sharply. "That's me," Henry replied, leaning back slightly in his chair. Something about their tone made him uneasy, but he kept his expression friendly. "What can I do for you folks?" Phillips glanced at Dawson before speaking again. "We got a report about some stolen garden tools. A neighbor says they're missing a rake and a pair of shears. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Henry blinked, surprised. "Stolen tools? No, sir, I don't. I haven't left my yard all week. Been sitting right here most days enjoying the weather." Dawson raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because your backyard looks pretty messy. Looks like someone's been digging around back there." Henry chuckled softly. "Oh, that's just my grandson. He came by last weekend to plant some bulbs. Kids these days, they dig holes everywhere." He laughed lightly, hoping to ease the tension, but the officers weren't amused. Phillips stepped closer, towering over Henry. "Listen, Mr. Jackson, we're not playing games here. Someone saw somebody sneaking around this area late last night, and guess what? Your house is the closest to where those tools went missing." Henry felt his stomach tighten. He set his coffee mug down carefully and stood up, using his cane for support. "I understand you're doing your job," he said slowly, "but I'm telling you, I didn't take anything. I've lived here for decades. Ask anyone, they'll tell you I'm no thief." Philip smirked. "Decades, huh? That's a long time to go unnoticed. Maybe you decided it was finally your turn to get something for free." The comment stung. Henry's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "With respect, officer, I think you're barking up the wrong tree. I'm 72 years old. Why would I risk my reputation over a rake?" Dawson snorted. "People do strange things when they're desperate. Or maybe you're covering for someone else. Is there anyone else living here with you?" "No," Henry answered firmly. "It's just me. My wife passed away years ago and my kids live out of state. This is my home and I take care of it." Phillips exchanged another glance with Dawson. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Well, Mr. Jackson, we're going to need you to come down to the station with us, just to clear things up." Henry froze. Handcuffs? For him? "You've got to be kidding," he muttered, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous. I told you, I didn't steal anything." "Then prove it," Philip snapped. "Come quietly, or we'll make this harder than it needs to be." Neighboring houses began to stir. Curtains twitched as people peeked outside to see what the commotion was about. Mrs. Harper from across the street hurried over, concern written all over her face. "Henry, what's going on?" she called out. "They think I stole some tools," Henry explained, trying to keep his tone light despite the situation. "Can you believe it?" Mrs. Harper turned to the officers. "This man wouldn't hurt a fly. He's one of the nicest people in this neighborhood. Whatever you're accusing him of, you're wrong. Dawson shrugged. Sorry, ma'am, but we have a duty to follow up on reports. If he's innocent, he'll be cleared soon enough. Henry sighed deeply. There was no point arguing. These officers weren't listening, and the more he protested, the worse things might get. He grabbed his cane and took a step forward. Fine, he said. Let's get this over with. As they led him toward the patrol car, Henry couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. How could this happen? In his own neighborhood, where he'd spent nearly half his life. He climbed into the back seat, gripping his cane tightly. Through the window, he saw Mrs. Harper shaking her head in disbelief. Once inside the car, Phillips started the engine while Dawson sat beside him, typing notes into her phone. Neither of them spoke to Henry. The ride to the station felt endless. Every bump in the road jolted him, making his old bones ache. But it wasn't the physical discomfort that bothered him most. It was the injustice of it all. At the station, Henry was taken to a small room with a table and 2 chairs. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the walls. Other officers passed by, glancing at him briefly before moving on. Some looked curious. Others seemed indifferent. After what felt like hours, a detective entered the room. He introduced himself as Detective Ryan. Unlike Phillips and Dawson, Ryan seemed less aggressive. He offered Henry a glass of water and asked if he wanted to call anyone. Henry thought for a moment. My son, he said finally. Marcus Jackson. He's a judge. Detective Ryan paused, pen hovering over his notepad. A judge, huh? Well, maybe he can explain why we got a tip about stolen property being hidden near your property line. Henry shook his head. Because it's nonsense. Pure nonsense. As the questioning continued, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than garden tools. It was about who he was, and perhaps who his son was too. Little did the officers know, Judge Marcus Jackson wasn't someone to cross lightly. By the time the ordeal ended and Henry was released without charges, word had already spread through Maplewood. What started as a simple misunderstanding was about to become something much bigger. Across town, Marcus Jackson was wrapping up another long day at the courthouse. The room buzzed with quiet activity as clerks filed papers and lawyers packed their briefcases. Marcus sat at his desk, reviewing the final details of a high-profile case he had just presided over. It was a complicated matter involving corruption within a local business, and Marcus had ruled decisively, ensuring justice was served without bias or favoritism. At 45 years old, Marcus was known throughout Maplewood as a man who didn't tolerate wrongdoing. He wasn't loud or flashy. He carried himself with quiet authority, his deep voice commanding respect whenever he spoke. Lawyers often joked that arguing in front of Judge Jackson felt like standing on thin ice. One wrong step, and you were gone. But beneath his stern exterior lay a deep sense of fairness and compassion. Marcus believed in the law not as a weapon, but as a tool to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. As he closed the file on his desk, Marcus glanced at the clock. It was nearly 6 o'clock. Fridays were special for him because they meant one thing: visiting his father. Henry Jackson lived alone now ever since Marcus's mother passed away 10 years earlier. Though Marcus was busy with work, he made it a point to see his dad every Friday evening. Those visits were sacred, a chance to reconnect, share stories, and simply be together. Marcus grabbed his coat and headed out of the courthouse. The air outside was cool, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. He climbed into his car, a modest sedan that showed its age but still ran reliably. As he drove toward his childhood home, his mind wandered back to memories of growing up in Maplewood. His father had worked hard to provide for the family, taking on odd jobs when money was tight. Marcus remembered how proud Henry was when his son graduated from law school and eventually became a judge. "You're making a difference," Henry would say. "That's all I ever wanted, for you to make this world better." But as Marcus turned onto his father's street, something felt off. There was an ambulance parked near Henry's house, its lights flashing silently in the fading daylight. A small crowd of neighbors stood nearby, whispering among themselves. Marcus's heart sank. He parked quickly and rushed over, dread gnawing at him. "What happened?" he asked, pushing through the group until he reached Mrs. Harper, the elderly woman who lived across the street. "Oh, Marcus," she exclaimed, her face lighting up with relief. "Thank goodness you're here. It's your father. He's okay, don't worry. But there was some trouble earlier." "Trouble?" Marcus repeated, his voice sharp with concern. "What kind of trouble?" Mrs. Harper hesitated, glancing around as if unsure where to start. Finally, she said, "2 police officers came by this morning. They accused Henry of stealing garden tools or something like that. Can you believe it? They treated him so poorly, Marcus. They even took him down to the station." Marcus froze, his mind racing. Garden tools? His father? It sounded absurd. Henry wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone steal from anyone, and yet here was evidence that someone, people sworn to serve and protect, had disrespected the man who raised him. "Where is he now?" Marcus asked. His tone clipped. "He's back home," Mrs. Harper replied quickly. "They released him after questioning, but, well, it shook him up, Marcus. He's sitting on the porch steps right now." Without another word, Marcus strode toward the house. Sure enough, there was Henry, perched on the bottom step of the porch, leaning on his cane. His shoulders were slumped, and his expression was distant, as though he were lost in thought. When he heard footsteps approaching, he looked up and managed a weak smile. "Hey, son," Henry said softly. "You're here early." Marcus knelt beside him, studying his face carefully. "Dad, are you okay? What happened?" Henry sighed, shaking his head. "It's nothing, really, just a misunderstanding. Some officers came by this morning accusing me of taking garden tools from a neighbor. Said they got a tip about it. I tried to explain, but..." His voice trailed off and he shrugged. "It doesn't matter. I'm fine." "It does matter," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm. "Who were these officers? What did they say to you?" Henry hesitated, clearly reluctant to upset his son further. "Their names were Phillips and Dawson. They weren't exactly polite, Marcus. They acted like I was guilty before I even opened my mouth. Took me down to the station, asked a bunch of questions. But I told them the truth. I didn't do anything wrong." Marcus clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. He knew how these situations could escalate, especially for someone like his father, an elderly black man living alone in a predominantly white neighborhood. It was a recipe for prejudice, whether intentional or not. And while Henry might brush it off as no big deal, Marcus couldn't let it slide. "Did they hurt you?" Marcus asked, his eyes scanning his father for any signs of injury. No, Henry assured him. "They didn't lay a hand on me, just talked down to me like I was some criminal, like I wasn't worth listening to." "That's unacceptable," Marcus muttered under his breath. He stood up, pacing back and forth on the driveway. Neighbors watched curiously from a distance, sensing the tension in the air. Marcus turned back to his father. "Dad, I need you to tell me everything they said, every detail. I'm going to handle this." Henry frowned, shaking his head again. "Marcus, don't bother. It's not worth it. These things happen sometimes. People get accused of things they didn't do. It's part of life." "No, Dad," Marcus replied firmly. "This isn't just part of life. This is wrong. You deserve respect, especially from people who are supposed to protect you. If they can treat you like this, what does that say about how they treat others? I won't stand for it." Henry looked at his son, pride mingling with worry in his eyes. He knew Marcus well enough to recognize that determined look. Once his boy set his mind to something, there was no stopping him. Still, Henry couldn't help but feel uneasy. "Just be careful, Marcus. Don't make this bigger than it needs to be." "I'll be careful," Marcus promised, "but I'm not letting this slide." After reassuring his father that he'd take care of things, Marcus returned to his car. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start. Back at the courthouse, he had access to records and resources most people didn't. Officers Phillips and Dawson might think they were untouchable, but Marcus intended to prove otherwise. Driving back to the courthouse, Marcus replayed the conversation, with his father in his mind. The image of Henry sitting on the porch steps, looking smaller and more vulnerable than usual, fueled his resolve. For years, Marcus had dedicated himself to fighting injustice in courtrooms, holding corrupt individuals accountable. Now the fight had come to his own doorstep. When he arrived at the courthouse, the building was mostly empty, save for a few late-working staff members. Marcus headed straight to his chambers, pulling out files and logging into the system. First, he pulled up the records for officers Greg Phillips and Laura Dawson. Their personnel files contained standard information, dates of hire, commendations, training history. But buried within the documents were red flags, multiple complaints from citizens alleging rude behavior, excessive force, and racial profiling. None of the complaints had resulted in disciplinary action. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. This wasn't the first time these officers had crossed the line. In fact, it seemed like a pattern. He jotted down notes, organizing the information methodically. Then he began drafting a formal request for an internal investigation into their conduct. As a judge, he had the authority to demand accountability, and he wasn't afraid to use it. As the hours passed, Marcus worked tirelessly, piecing together evidence and preparing his case. By the time he finally left the courthouse, it was well past midnight. The streets of Maplewood were silent, bathed in the glow of streetlights. Exhaustion tugged at him, but his mind remained sharp, focused on the task ahead. The next morning, Marcus called a meeting with the police chief. He presented his findings calmly but forcefully, leaving no room for excuses. "I expect a full investigation into the actions of Officers Phillips and Dawson," he stated. "And I want transparency. The community deserves to know that justice will be served." The police chief, a grizzled man named Alan Meyer, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Judge Jackson, I understand your concerns, but we have procedures in place." "I'm aware of the procedures," Marcus interrupted. "But I also know how easily they can be ignored. Let me make one thing clear. If this department values integrity, you'll address this issue promptly. Otherwise, I'll take my concerns elsewhere." Meyer nodded reluctantly. "Understood, Your Honor. We'll look into it." Satisfied, for now, Marcus left the station. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change rarely came without resistance, especially in a town like Maplewood. But he was prepared to fight, not just for his father, but for everyone who deserved to live free from fear and prejudice. Back at home, Henry sat on the porch once again, watching the sun rise over the horizon. He saw Marcus's car pull into the driveway and smiled faintly. Whatever storm was brewing, he trusted his son to weather it. After all, Marcus had always been his greatest source of pride and hope. The morning after Marcus Jackson confronted the police chief, Officers Greg Phillips and Laura Dawson arrived at the station feeling confident. They had spent years navigating the system, knowing how to avoid consequences for their actions. To them, accusing Henry Jackson of stealing garden tools was just another routine call. Sure, it might have been a bit harsh, but that was part of the job. People like Henry, older, quieter, less likely to fight back, were easy targets, or so they thought. As they settled into their desks, sipping coffee and chatting casually, neither officer gave much thought to the events of the previous day. Phillips joked about the old guy who couldn't even remember where he'd left his cane, while Dawson laughed along, agreeing that Henry probably didn't know what day it was. Their laughter echoed through the nearly empty room, drawing annoyed glances from other officers trying to focus on their work. But then, Phillips's phone buzzed with an alert. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It was a notification summoning him and Dawson to Judge Jackson's chambers later that afternoon. The message included no explanation, only a time and location. "What's this about?" Dawson asked, leaning over to read the text. "No idea," Phillips replied, shrugging. "Probably some minor thing. Maybe someone filed a complaint about us during that traffic stop last week." Dawson rolled her eyes. "Great. Just what we need. A lecture from some judge about being polite. Like anyone actually cares." Neither officer seemed particularly worried. After all, judges rarely interfered directly with police matters unless something major happened, and as far as they knew, nothing major had occurred recently. A stolen rake? Hardly worth mentioning. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Jackson was preparing for the meeting. He had spent hours reviewing every detail of Phillips and Dawson's records, compiling a damning list of incidents that painted a clear picture of misconduct. Complaints from citizens described similar patterns: dismissive attitudes, unnecessary aggression, and blatant disregard for due process. Some victims claimed the officers had planted evidence or fabricated stories to justify arrests. While none of the complaints had led to formal investigations before, Marcus was determined to change that. Sitting in his office at the courthouse, Marcus stared at the stack of papers in front of him. Each document represented not just a violation of trust, but also a failure of the system meant to protect people like his father. For years, he had fought against corruption in various forms, but this case hit closer to home than any other. Every word he read fueled his anger, but also his resolve. Today he would make sure justice was served. Before heading to his chambers, Marcus took a moment to call his father. Henry answered on the second ring, his voice soft but steady. "Hey, Dad," Marcus said. "Just checking in. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, son," Henry replied. "Still a little tired, but I'll be okay. What about you? You sounded pretty upset yesterday." Marcus hesitated, unsure how much to share. "I'm handling things. I've got a meeting today with the officers who came to your house. I want to make sure they understand the seriousness of what they did." Henry sighed. "Marcus, I appreciate what you're doing, but don't let this eat at you. These things happen sometimes. We move on." "We shouldn't have to move on," Marcus countered gently. "Not until people learn to treat each other with respect." "Don't worry, Dad, I'll take care of it." After hanging up, Marcus gathered his notes and headed to his chambers. By the time Phillips and Dawson arrived, he was seated behind his desk, his expression unreadable but commanding. The two officers entered hesitantly, glancing around the room as if expecting someone else to join them. "Judge Jackson," Phillips began, his tone uncertain. "We got your message. Is everything all right?" Marcus gestured for them to sit. "Everything depends on your perspective," he said evenly. "Let's start with why you're here. Do either of you recall visiting an elderly man named Henry Jackson earlier this week?" Phillips and Dawson exchanged quick glances. "Yes, sir," Phillips replied cautiously. "We responded to a report about stolen property near his residence. We followed standard protocol." "Standard protocol," Marcus repeated slowly, his voice laced with skepticism. "So harassing a 72-year-old man, dragging him to the station and treating him like a criminal without evidence? That's standard protocol?" Dawson shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "We were just doing our jobs, Your Honor. Someone reported the theft and Mr. Jackson matched the description." "Matched the description?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What description? An elderly black man living alone?" "Because that seems to be the only criteria you needed." The room fell silent. Phillips opened his mouth to respond, but quickly closed it again, realizing there was no good answer. Dawson looked down at her hands, avoiding eye contact. Marcus leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Let me tell you something about Henry Jackson. He's my father. He's lived in this community for over 40 years, contributing more to this town than most people will in a lifetime. Yet you saw fit to accuse him of theft, based on nothing more than a vague tip. Did it ever occur to you that maybe the real issue lies with your approach, not with him?" Philip stammered, clearly caught off guard. "Your Honor, we didn't mean—" "You didn't think," Marcus interrupted sharply. "That's the problem. You didn't think about the impact of your actions. You didn't consider the harm caused by assuming guilt without proof. And worst of all, you didn't care enough to question whether you were wrong." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Now, I've reviewed your records. Both of you have histories of complaints alleging misconduct, racial profiling, excessive force, disrespectful behavior. None of these allegations resulted in discipline because the system failed to hold you accountable. But that ends today." Phillips and Dawson exchanged panicked looks. This wasn't just a reprimand. It was a threat. They had underestimated the situation entirely. I'm ordering a full internal investigation into your conduct, Marcus stated firmly. Until it's complete, both of you are suspended pending review. If the findings confirm what I suspect, further action will follow. Am I clear? Yes, Your Honor. They muttered in unison, their voices barely audible. Good. Now get out of my sight. As the officers hurriedly left the room, Marcus exhaled deeply, feeling a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. Holding them accountable was only the first step. Real change would require addressing deeper issues within the department and the community as a whole. Later that evening, Marcus visited his father again. Henry was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. When he saw Marcus approaching, he smiled faintly. How did it go? Henry asked. It went well, Marcus replied, taking a seat beside him. They'll be investigated, and they won't get away with treating people the way they treated you, Henry nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. Do you think it'll make a difference? Changing one or two officers won't fix everything. No, it won't, Marcus admitted. But it's a start, and sometimes starting small is the only way to create lasting change. Henry patted his son's hand affectionately. You always were stubborn, Marcus, but I suppose that's why you're so good at what you do. Marcus chuckled softly. Stubbornness runs in the family. As they sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of the day began to lift. For now, justice had been served. But Marcus knew the fight was far from over. The news of officers Greg Phillips and Laura Dawson's suspension spread quickly through the Maplewood Police Department. At first, it was just whispered conversations in the break room or muttered complaints during shift changes. But by the end of the day, everyone knew what had happened and who was behind it. Judge Marcus Jackson had stepped in personally, demanding accountability for their actions against his father, Henry Jackson. For many officers, this came as a shock. They were used to operating with little oversight, knowing that complaints against them rarely led to consequences. The department's leadership often brushed off accusations of misconduct, dismissing them as misunderstandings or exaggerations. But now one of the most respected and feared judges in town had taken a stand. And when Judge Jackson spoke, people listened. Detective Alan Meyer, the police chief, found himself caught between two forces: the growing pressure from the public to address systemic issues within the force and the resistance from his own officers, who felt betrayed by the sudden scrutiny. Meyer wasn't a bad man. He genuinely believed in serving the community. But he also understood the delicate balance required to keep morale high among his team. For years, he had turned a blind eye to minor infractions, hoping to avoid conflict. Now that decision was coming back to haunt him. Meyer called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. The room was tense as officers filed in, their faces etched with frustration and anger. Some crossed their arms defiantly. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Meyer stood at the front of the room, clearing his throat before speaking. I know, tempers are running high, he began, his voice firm but calm. But we need to face facts. Judge Jackson isn't someone we can ignore. He has evidence of repeated misconduct, not just from Phillips and Dawson, but potentially others too. If we don't handle this properly, it could blow up in our faces. One of the sergeants, a burly man named Carl, leaned forward. So what? Are you saying, Chief, that we roll over and let him dictate how we do our jobs? No, Meyer replied sharply. I'm saying we cooperate fully with the investigation. We show the public, and Judge Jackson, that we're committed to transparency and reform. If we fight this, it'll only make us look guilty. Carl snorted. Reform? You really think suspending a couple of officers is going to fix anything? People like Jackson will never be satisfied. They want to tear us down completely. That's not true, Meyer shot back. And even if it were, does that give us an excuse to behave poorly? To treat people unfairly? Look, I get it. This job isn't easy. But we swore an oath to serve and protect. Not just some of the community, but all of it. If we've lost sight of that, then yeah, maybe we do need reform. The room fell silent after Meyer's words. No one dared argue further, though resentment lingered in the air. As the meeting ended, Officers returned to their duties, grumbling under their breath about activist judges and political correctness. Meanwhile, Meyer reached out to Judge Jackson, assuring him that the investigation would proceed fairly and thoroughly. It was a promise Meyer intended to keep, for the sake of the department and the town. While tension simmered at the police station, word of the scandal reached the wider community. Reporters descended on Maplewood, eager to uncover the truth behind the story. Local news outlets ran headlines like "Judge takes on police misconduct" and "Elderly man wrongly accused sparks outcry." Social media buzzed with reactions ranging from outrage to support. Henry Jackson became an unexpected symbol of resilience. Neighbors stopped by his house daily, offering kind words and sharing similar stories of mistreatment by law enforcement. One woman told him about being pulled over for no reason other than driving through a predominantly white neighborhood. Another recounted how her teenage son had been detained simply for walking home late at night. These encounters reminded Henry of why his son was fighting so hard, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless. Despite the attention, Henry tried to maintain his usual routine. He watered his garden, read books on the porch, and greeted passers-by with a smile. Still, the weight of the situation lingered. He couldn't help but feel guilty for putting Marcus in such a difficult position. After all, standing up to the police department meant risking backlash, not just professionally but personally. One evening, as father and son sat together on the porch, Henry voiced his concerns. "Marcus, I hate seeing you go through this. Because of me. What if it affects your career? What if people turn against you?" Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad, none of this is your fault. You didn't ask for any of this to happen. Those officers made a choice to disrespect you, to abuse their power. I'm not doing this just for you. I'm doing it for everyone who deserves better." "But what about the backlash?" Henry pressed. "People are already talking. Some say you're using your position to settle scores." "Let them talk," Marcus said firmly. "If they're more concerned about protecting bad cops than ensuring justice, then their opinions don't matter. Besides, I've faced worse criticism in my career. This won't break me." Henry nodded slowly, though doubt still flickered in his eyes. "Just promise me one thing," he said softly. "Don't let this consume you. You've got a life outside of this fight." "I won't, Dad," Marcus assured him, "but I also won't back down." As the investigation unfolded, Marcus threw himself into the work. He spent hours reviewing files, interviewing witnesses, and collaborating with independent auditors brought in to assess the department's practices. Each new piece of evidence reinforced his belief that the problem went beyond Phillips and Dawson. Complaints of racial profiling, excessive force, and negligence spanned years, affecting countless residents. One particularly damning case involved a young black teenager named Jamal Carter. Jamal had been stopped while walking home from a basketball game, accused of carrying stolen goods despite having nothing on him but his gym bag. The officer who detained him claimed Jamal fit the description of a suspect, a vague statement that included phrases like dark-skinned male and wearing athletic clothing. When Jamal protested, the officer handcuffed him and left him sitting on the curb for over an hour before releasing him without explanation. Jamal's mother, Karen, tearfully recounted the incident to Marcus during an interview. "He's a good kid," she said, clutching a tissue. "Never been in trouble, but that night changed him. He doesn't trust the police anymore. How can I blame him?" Stories like Jamal's fueled Marcus's determination. He knew change wouldn't come overnight, but exposing the truth was a crucial step. With each revelation, the pressure on the police department grew stronger. Officers began to feel the weight of accountability, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about their behavior. At the same time, Marcus worked to build bridges within the community. He attended town hall meetings, listening to residents' concerns and offering solutions. He partnered with local organizations to provide training on implicit bias and de-escalation tactics. Slowly but surely, people started to see him not just as a judge, but as a leader willing to fight for real change. Back at the courthouse, Marcus received both praise and criticism for his efforts. Supporters hailed him as a champion of justice, while detractors accused him of overstepping his bounds. Letters poured in from across the country, some thanking him for standing up to corruption, others condemning him for undermining law enforcement. Through it all, Marcus remained focused. He knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but he refused to give up. Every setback only strengthened his resolve. And whenever doubt crept in, he thought of his father, sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, embodying quiet, strength and dignity. Change was coming to Maplewood whether people liked it or not, and Marcus Jackson was determined to lead the way. The investigation into officers Greg Phillips and Laura Dawson dragged on for weeks, uncovering more than anyone expected. What started as a probe into their treatment of Henry Jackson turned into a broader examination of the Maplewood Police Department's practices. Independent auditors pored over years of records, interviewing residents, reviewing body camera footage, and analyzing patterns of misconduct. The findings painted a grim picture. Systemic issues plagued the department, from racial profiling to excessive use of force. At first, many officers tried to downplay the results, insisting that isolated incidents didn't reflect the entire force. But as evidence mounted, denial became harder to sustain. Complaints against Phillips and Dawson alone revealed a pattern of targeting marginalized communities, particularly elderly individuals and young people of color. Other officers were implicated too, though none as severely as the two suspended cops. For Phillips and Dawson, the suspension felt like a punishment worse than jail. They couldn't leave their homes without hearing whispers or seeing accusatory stares. Their neighbors, once friendly, now avoided them. Even colleagues who had initially defended them began to distance themselves, fearing guilt by association. The media coverage didn't help either. Local newspapers ran stories highlighting their past behavior, complete with quotes from victims describing how they'd been mistreated. Phillips grew increasingly bitter, convinced that Judge Marcus Jackson was orchestrating everything out of personal vendetta. "He's not doing this for justice," he muttered to Dawson during one of their rare phone calls. "It's revenge. That old man lied about stealing tools and his son can't handle it." Dawson wasn't so sure. She had always prided herself on being tough but fair, or at least she told herself that. Now doubts crept in. Had they really been too harsh? Too quick to judge? She replayed her encounter with Henry in her mind, remembering how calm and composed he'd been despite their accusations. Maybe they had crossed a line. But admitting that meant accepting responsibility and facing consequences far greater than suspension. As the investigation continued, Judge Jackson pushed for reforms within the department. He worked closely with city officials, proposing new policies aimed at increasing transparency and accountability. Body cameras would be mandatory for all officers, and footage would be reviewed regularly for signs of misconduct. Training programs focused on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques were introduced, while an independent oversight board was established to review complaints. Not everyone welcomed these changes. Some officers argued that the measures would make their jobs harder, forcing them to second-guess every decision. Others claimed the reforms unfairly singled out law enforcement, ignoring the challenges they faced daily. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. Meanwhile, Henry Jackson found himself thrust into the spotlight. Neighbors treated him like a hero, stopping by his house to thank him for standing up to injustice. Community leaders invited him to speak at rallies and town hall meetings, hoping his story would inspire others to share their experiences. At first, Henry resisted, uncomfortable with the attention. But Marcus encouraged him to embrace the role. "Dad, you've already made a difference," Marcus said one evening as they sat on the porch. "People see you as proof that even when things seem hopeless, there's still power in speaking out. You don't have to do anything drastic. Just be yourself. That's enough." Henry hesitated, then nodded. "All right, son. If it helps someone else, I'll try." And so, Henry began attending local events, sharing his experience in simple, heartfelt words. He talked about growing up in a time when discrimination was blatant and unchecked, yet finding joy and purpose in building a life for his family. He spoke of raising Marcus, teaching him to value fairness and integrity above all else. And he described the fear and frustration he felt when confronted by Phillips and Dawson, emphasizing the importance of treating everyone with respect. His speeches resonated deeply with audiences. People saw in Henry not just a victim of injustice, but a symbol of resilience. Younger generations especially looked to him as a reminder that change was possible, even if it came slowly and painfully. While Henry inspired hope, Marcus tackled the practical side of reform. He spent countless hours drafting proposals, meeting with policymakers and addressing concerns from both sides. It wasn't easy. Resistance remained strong among certain factions of the police department and community. Critics accused him of prioritizing politics over public safety, claiming stricter regulations would embolden criminals. Supporters praised his efforts, calling him a beacon of integrity in a flawed system. One particularly heated debate took place at a city council meeting. Dozens of residents packed the room, eager to voice their opinions. Some demanded immediate action, pointing to decades of neglect and abuse. Others urged caution, warning that hasty decisions could backfire. Voices rose, tempers flared, and chairs scraped against the floor as people shifted uncomfortably. Marcus stood at the podium, waiting patiently for the noise to subside. When silence finally fell, he addressed the crowd in his usual measured tone. "I understand the fears on both sides," he began. "No one wants to live in a world where crime runs rampant, nor does anyone want to feel unsafe because of those tasked with protecting us. The solution lies in balance, in holding ourselves accountable while striving to improve." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "We cannot ignore the harm caused by unchecked power. Nor can we dismiss the bravery of officers who risk their lives every day to keep us safe. Reform isn't about punishment, it's about progress. It's about ensuring that everyone, regardless of race, age, or background, is treated with dignity and respect." His speech earned applause from some attendees, though grumbles of disagreement rippled through others. Still, Marcus knew he had planted a seed. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but each step forward mattered. Back at home, Henry watched the news coverage of the ongoing reforms, marveling at how much had changed since that fateful morning. He thought about Phillips and Dawson, wondering what they must be feeling. Did they regret their actions? Or did they still believe they were justified? One afternoon, as Henry tended to his garden, a familiar figure approached his house. It was Detective Alan Meyer, the police chief. Henry straightened, surprised to see him. "Mr. Jackson," Meyer said, tipping his hat respectfully. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Henry gestured toward the porch steps. "Of course, have a seat." Meyer hesitated before sitting down, clearly uneasy. "First, let me apologize for myself and for my department. What happened to you should never have occurred. We failed you, and for that, I'm truly sorry." Henry studied the man for a moment, searching for sincerity. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you for saying that, it means a lot. I also wanted to assure you that we're taking steps to prevent this from happening again." Meyer continued. "Reforms are underway and we're committed to making meaningful changes. It won't be easy, but we owe it to the community, and to people like you, to do better." Henry smiled faintly. "That's good to hear. Mistakes can't undo themselves, but acknowledging them is a start." Meyer nodded, looking relieved. "Thank you for understanding, and please, if you ever need anything, if something doesn't feel right, don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to serve." After Meyer left, Henry sat quietly, reflecting on the conversation. He knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time in a while he felt hopeful. Change was possible, not just in Maplewood, but everywhere. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the yard, Henry leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee. For all the pain and struggle, he realized something important. Sometimes standing your ground could spark a movement, and maybe, just maybe, that movement could lead to a brighter future. Weeks turned into months, and the ripple effects of Henry Jackson's ordeal continued to spread throughout Maplewood. The investigation into officers Greg Phillips and Laura Dawson reached its conclusion, leaving no room for doubt about their misconduct. Both were formally dismissed from the police department, their careers ended by years of unchecked behavior. While some residents celebrated the decision, others grumbled that it was too harsh, arguing that mistakes shouldn't cost someone their livelihood. But for many, especially those who had suffered silently under similar treatment, justice finally felt within reach. The broader reforms proposed by Judge Marcus Jackson began to take shape. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers, and footage was reviewed weekly by an independent oversight board. Training programs on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques were implemented, requiring every officer to attend. New policies ensured that complaints against law enforcement were investigated thoroughly and transparently. Slowly, but surely, trust began to rebuild between the community and the police force. Still, change didn't come without resistance. Some officers quit rather than adapt to the new rules, claiming the reforms made their jobs impossible. Others adapted reluctantly, muttering under their breath about political correctness. A few embraced the changes, recognizing them as necessary steps toward fairness and accountability. Over time, these officers became leaders within the department, mentoring newer recruits and setting examples of professionalism and respect. For Henry, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but with a twist. He remained the quiet, kind man everyone knew and loved, yet his role in sparking reform earned him newfound admiration. Neighbors often stopped by to thank him or share updates about how the changes were impacting their lives. One woman recounted how her teenage son, once terrified of being pulled over, now felt safer driving through town. Another described how an officer had apologized after mistakenly accusing her of shoplifting, a gesture she never expected but deeply appreciated. Henry accepted the praise humbly, always deflecting attention back to the community. "I didn't do this alone," he would say. "It took all of us standing together to make a difference." Marcus, meanwhile, continued balancing his duties as a judge with his advocacy for systemic reform. His efforts earned national recognition, with reporters traveling to Maplewood to interview him about his work. Some praised him as a pioneer in the fight for justice. Others criticized him for overstepping his role. Through it all, Marcus remained steadfast, knowing that true progress required sacrifice. One evening, as father and son sat together on the porch, Marcus reflected on the journey they'd been through. "You know, Dad, I never imagined something like this would happen when I started my career. I just wanted to uphold the law, to make sure people were treated fairly. But seeing what you went through, it reminded me why I chose this path." Henry chuckled softly. "Funny how life works, isn't it? You spend years trying to protect others, and then one day you end up protecting your own father." "It wasn't just about you," Marcus replied earnestly. "What happened to you showed me how deep these issues run. If we hadn't acted, nothing would have changed, and I couldn't live with that." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "Well, I'm proud of you, son. Proud of everything you've done, and everything you'll keep doing." As winter approached, Maplewood transformed into a picturesque scene of frost-covered trees and cozy homes adorned with holiday lights. The town held its annual Christmas celebration in the park, drawing families from across the area. For the first time in years, the event included speeches from community leaders about unity and progress. Henry was invited to speak, and though he initially hesitated, Marcus encouraged him to accept. Standing before a crowd of bundled-up residents, Henry gripped the microphone tightly, his breath visible in the cold air. "When I was growing up," he began, his voice steady despite the chill, "things weren't easy. There were times when I wondered if things would ever get better. But I learned something important. Hope doesn't die unless we let it. Change might be slow, but it's possible if we work together." He paused, glancing at Marcus, who stood nearby with a proud smile. "This year I saw proof of that, not just because of what happened to me, but because of how everyone came together to demand better, for themselves, for their children, for the future. So tonight, as we celebrate, let's remember that our strength lies in each other. Let's keep pushing forward even when it's hard, because that's how we build a world worth living in." The crowd erupted in applause, cheering loudly as Henry stepped away from the podium. Marcus wrapped an arm around his father's shoulders, pulling him close. That was perfect, Dad. Just perfect. Henry grinned, shaking his head modestly. I just said what was in my heart, nothing fancy. Sometimes, Marcus said, that's exactly what people need to hear. In the weeks that followed, the spirit of cooperation in Maplewood grew stronger. Residents organized neighborhood watch groups, working alongside officers to ensure safety. Schools introduced programs teaching students about civic responsibility and the importance of speaking out against injustice. Even small businesses pitched in, hosting fundraisers to support local initiatives aimed at fostering equality and understanding. Phillips and Dawson faded from public memory, their names replaced by stories of resilience and triumph. Jamal Carter, the teenager wrongfully detained, joined a youth mentorship program designed to bridge gaps between young people and law enforcement. Karen, his mother, volunteered as a community liaison, helping others navigate interactions with the police. For Henry and Marcus, life settled into a peaceful rhythm. They spent weekends gardening, cooking meals together, and watching old movies. Though neither forgot the challenges they'd faced, they chose to focus on the positives, the connections forged, the lessons learned, and the hope ignited. 1. Crisp morning. As Henry sipped coffee on the porch, he glanced at Marcus, who was reading the newspaper beside him. You know, Henry said suddenly, I used to think the world was getting worse, that people cared less about each other than they used to. But now I think maybe we're heading in the right direction. Marcus looked up, smiling warmly. We are, Dad, one step at a time. Henry nodded, gazing out at the quiet street. Children played in the distance, laughter echoing through the air. Cars passed slowly, drivers waving hello as they went. It was a simple scene, ordinary in many ways, but to Henry, it was extraordinary. Proof that even after darkness, light could shine through. And so, as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its golden glow over Mapleworth, Henry and Marcus sat side by side, content in the knowledge that their actions had sparked something greater than either of them could have imagined. Change wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick. But it was happening, and that was enough.